By the time that Paul wrote this letter, temples had dotted the ancient Near East for millennia. Likewise, the household had long been a centerpiece of Roman and even Greek society. It was important in Jewish society as well, but they don't use that term household the way that the Romans and Greeks did. And yet in our text, Paul takes these commonplaces of Ephesian life and redefines them, deploys them as powerful metaphors, and in so doing, reshapes his audience's understanding of the people of God. That is what this text is about. It is about this people that God is creating, this new humanity that is, Paul shows us in these verses, a cohesive whole. Now let's recall Paul's logic. We talked about this last week, but it's important to remind ourselves of this logic, and it's real simple at one level. Anthropology plus soteriology equals ecclesiology. In other words, our understanding of humanity, when paired with our understanding of God's saving work in the world, produces a very specific understanding of the church. But of course, as we showed last week, that logic is even more sophisticated, thoughtful, considered than this simple equation shows. Paul moves seamlessly in and out of these concerns for what it means to be human, what our real trouble is as humans, what is it that is really afflicting us, and what God is doing to remedy that situation. And if you'll recall, what we said was that through Christ's atoning work, a new humanity is created. What had been divided through God's special interactions with the people of Israel is now reunited. Not because the church replaces Israel, but rather because all who believe, Israelite or non, are brought together in one new humanity. And it is that new humanity that is reconciled to God. So the work of Christ is not simply a sacrifice for sins. It is also a work of reconciliation. Reconciliation between us and God, yes, but reconciliation between us and us. Now, as Paul moves forward in our text, he wants us to understand that, yes, this new humanity has been created, but it's not just sort of out there willy-nilly. These are not emancipated individuals just moving about the ancient Roman world doing their own thing. God is doing something with this new humanity. He is creating a new entity that is populated by this new humanity. In our text, he calls it the Hagioi, the holy ones. Your translation might render it saints. But the NIV and other modern translations render it the people of God, or God's holy people. That is this entity that is being created. But Paul uses 3 metaphors to unpack for us what this entity is like and its implications for those who participate in it. The first metaphor is citizenship. And with each one of these metaphors, Paul is trying to communicate at least one significant thing about those who participate in this entity called the holy ones, the people of God, what Paul will later call the church. And citizenship communicates standing. Whenever there is a lawsuit in the United States, whether it's in state court or federal court, one of the first things that a judge has to figure out is, do the plaintiffs, or does the plaintiff, have standing to file this lawsuit? So, if you're a resident of New Hampshire, you do not have standing to file a lawsuit against the city of Ranger for not providing enough brisket to its citizens. The judge might well ask, what does that have to do with you? Right? Now that's, of course, a very simplistic example, but it helps us to get our heads around this notion of citizenship. Especially since this people that God is forming is not a democracy. It is an absolute monarchy, right? And when we talk about the people who live under the authority of an absolute monarch, we don't call them citizens. We call them subjects. But that is not the language that Paul uses. He calls his Ephesian readers and those of us who read the letter today citizens. Citizens together with all of God's holy people. We are all citizens. We all have standing. Think back to verse 18. If you want to, just run one line up. What is Paul talking about there? He's talking about access to the Father that everyone shares equally, right? It's the same idea. We are citizens. We have standing before this absolute monarch to bring our requests and so much more. The next metaphor that Paul uses is the metaphor of the household. He says that those of us who participate in this people of God are citizens together with the saints and members of God's household. Now, the household was the fundamental unit of organization in Roman society. It was presided over by a pater familias. I've only been saying that word for about 20 years, so, it took me that long to learn how to stumble over it. A pater familias. It's a Latin term. We might kind of literally translate it, father of the household or father of the family. And every member of the household falls in line behind the pater familias. Now that includes his wife, their children, especially unmarried daughters, any daughters-in-law who have borne sons now belong to their husband's household. Grandchildren, other miscellaneous relatives who maybe don't have a household to belong to, slaves, paid workers, sometimes even friends and other assorted hangers-on. That's the household. And it can be a big group, as you can imagine. Particularly in elite contexts, people with wealth and status and power. Now, it's interesting that Paul describes this as a household, and he does actually use a Greek word there that means household. It's not house. But then he goes on to describe a building project, right? Typical Paul. He likes to mix his metaphors. But why? Why does Paul mix his metaphors? Because he's trying to communicate something too marvelous for words, and he doesn't have the time, like Cicero or Marcus Aurelius, to line it out conceptually. He's a pastor, after all. He's got too much work to do. So what is Paul trying to communicate as he mixes this metaphor of a household that is then fitted together and built upon this auspicious foundation? Well, one thing he's trying to communicate is belonging. When you have a household, you have an identity. Remember what I've taught you. In this culture, your identity is both in your own mind and in the minds of people around you. Your identity is framed by the groups to which you belong. A household gives you an identity. It gives you people that you belong to, people that you can say, I'm one of them. And I think one of the things that we are learning as a society is that it's actually really important to have a them to belong to. Robert Putnam's famous book, Bowling Alone, more than a quarter century ago, described the demise of bowling leagues. And Putnam saw it as the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, for a society that was losing its institutions of belonging. We were becoming too atomized, too individualized. Belonging is important. But this metaphor of the household does something else. You see, your status as an individual was determined oftentimes by the status of the head of your household. So, if you're a member of a household whose head is the assistant night shift latrine cleaner, you're not going to have a very high status, are you? But, I mean, and by the way, and it doesn't matter if you're a son in that household. Your status is still not very high. But you can be a slave in Caesar's household, and your status is high, isn't it? Oh, I mean, technically, legally, you're still a slave, but you have access, especially if you're a household slave and you actually get to see Caesar's face. You have access to money and power. You have influence. You belong to something prestigious, something that matters. Well, let me ask you something. Does anybody have any higher status than God? Paul has already labored in chapter 1 to make sure we understand. No, they don't. God's status is qualitatively different. And so when we belong to His household, not only do we have belonging, we have brothers and sisters who share that household with us. But we have status, whether the world recognizes it or not. We are somebody. We are special to the one who really counts. Now, Paul switches metaphors again once we get down to verse 21, right? As he's talking about this building that's being built up on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets with Jesus Himself as the chief cornerstone. You're like, okay, I've got this picture in my head. We're doing a building. We're doing a house, right? Well, then Paul says that this temple rises, or perhaps better, grows. There goes Paul mixing his metaphors again. To form a temple for God. You and I are elements of that temple. Now, what does all that mean? Well, for us, it means purpose, right? We have a place in this temple. We have a role. We might just be one stone halfway up the southeast corner of the building. We might be one stone in the outside wall of the men's restroom. I don't know. Or I might be. But we're part of it. We have a role. We have a purpose. And it is a lofty purpose indeed. Because what is it that a temple does? A temple, as verse 22 will make explicit, a temple is the residence of the deity. A temple is the location where the deity is worshipped. A temple is the place where heaven and earth intersect. Where, to borrow some language from our Celtic brothers and sisters, where the veil is a little thinner, where we can see a little further. Sometimes people will say, when folks have experienced what has come to be known as church hurt, people will say, well, don't let that bother you, because you don't worship the church, you worship Jesus. And that's true, right? The problem is, Paul has been as explicit as he can be in Ephesians that the church is how the triune God is made known to the world. That's what temples do. They make God known to the people, and they bring the people to God. Now, just one little comment here about that. Paul here is speaking in the indicative. Okay? He's making declarations. This is what God is doing, right? But in that indicative is an implicit imperative, or at least a barometer by which we can measure how we're doing, right? Now, in verses 19 through 21, Paul is talking about the church universal, okay? He's talking about the big C church. But in verse 22, we have this really interesting transition. We have this bridge from the universal to the local. Notice what he says there. And you too. So he's talking about he's bringing the spotlight down on the Ephesian church, and he's saying, you too are being fitted together into a place where God dwells by His Spirit. Right? So in essence, what Paul is saying is that what is true of the universal is also true in microcosm in the local. But now I want you to remember something. Paul conceives of this temple as a growing institution, right? So if there's 6 or 7 one Sunday, Paul wants there to be 16 or 17 the next time. And then 60 or 70, maybe 3 or 4 years later. And you just keep going up. Because for Paul, as this temple grows, it becomes more of an appropriate vessel for God's Spirit. But regardless, one of the great promises of this text is that whether we are at the beginning of that growth process or at the end, God dwells among us by His Spirit. The universal is modeled in the local. In microcosm, yes, it's modeled in the local. Now, as we close, there's a couple of presuppositions that I think we see in this text. One is just applies to all Pauline thought. Whenever Paul is reflecting on things theoretically, he wants those things to have practical implications. And then, of course, the other is that what we've just said. The universal should be reflected in the local. So Paul will not allow us to concede, on the one hand, his points about anthropology and soteriology, but then on the other hand, argue against his points on ecclesiology. In other words, Paul will not let us say, yes, we are one humanity with one really serious problem called sin. And we are also one humanity in that God saves us by His grace. And then come along and say, but you people go worship over there, we'll stay over here, and never the twain shall meet. That's not how any of this works for Paul. For Paul, all who have put their faith in Christ belong to the one church. And it is in our mutual belonging that we bear witness to Christ's presence among us. Boy, does our world need that witness. It's hard. There's no getting around it. Paul knew that better than anybody. All the different arguments and fights he got into over this and that and the other. Paul knew. He understood. And yet, for Paul, the miracle of the church, he'll call it a mystery in our next chapter, was that all people, whether they had a theological claim on God or not from the Old Testament, all people belong. All people have equal status before God and equal access to God. All people participate in this new humanity when they accept God's grace through faith. Yes, for Paul it was a mystery how this could be. I think there were probably times when Paul was in some worship service in Thessalonica or Corinth. Or maybe even he thought, Lord, are you sure about this? It was a mystery to him, but it was a beautiful mystery. And it was a mystery that turned the Roman Empire upside down. And it can do the same in our world today. Let us pray.